All right, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be uncovering 4 ways to build food safety culture for supplier risk management. We've got some really great companies attending today. We've got Chobani, Campbell's, Nestle, Whole Foods, McDonald's, and more. So this is clearly a big topic for everyone, and that's no surprise for us. In recent years, what we've seen is a lot of increasing pressure on supply chain risk management. And that's coming from, GFSI certifications, from customers, and from regulations like FSMA. And this pressure has really led companies to take a lot more accountability for their suppliers. So we've seen the industry moving from, one-off verification and very limited supplier audits to much more continuous monitoring of supplier compliance. So suppliers are really becoming an extension of your own food safety culture, and companies are looking for ways to improve that. So in our opinion, the prerequisite for food safety culture among suppliers is visibility. So we're going to unpack 4 ways that you can enhance visibility for supplier risk management today, starting with how to enhance risk scoring in supplier applications, then unpacking supplier compliance metrics from ongoing records. Then we'll take a look at benchmarking and context and follow-up in supplier audits, and then close things off with real-time data sharing among multi-location or vertically integrated supply chains. So we believe that these 4 areas can really unlock better visibility, which can improve understanding and communication among your team, which can really build better accountability and control for your food safety culture. So in terms of the agenda today, we are going to have about 25 minutes in our panel interview. And then we're going to move on to a quick preview of how you can take action on some of the recommendations from the panel. At the end of today, we're going to open things up for audience Q&A. So as really quick housekeeping, we can't see or hear any audience members today. If you want to interact with us, you can just use the chat on the right-hand side of your window, and you can type in any questions that you want there. We'll try to get to them all at the end. I'm also going to call your attention really quickly. Beside chat, you'll see that there are polls. Today, we're going to launch some questions for you to answer. So we'd love to see your responses in the polls section as we launch those questions for you today. It's going to help us to kind of shape and tailor our content based on your interests. And then finally, there will be handouts. You'll see handouts beside polls. We'll have a handout from TAG at the end of today, so stay tuned for that. And as the final piece of housekeeping, the session will be recorded. So as somebody who's registered for today, you will receive the recording at the end. So we have a really great group today to unpack this topic. Really quickly, my name is Kevin Davies, and I'm the CMO of Provision Analytics. Before I joined Provision, I was founder and CEO of Canada's largest food waste processing network. We handled about 2 million pounds of food waste every month for corporate clients like Starbucks, and we turned that into a certified organic fertilizer alternative that we sold through retailers like Whole Foods. So I joined Provision about 3.5 years ago. And Provision, for those of you who don't know, it's a platform for digital food safety and QA. It's currently used by about 300 food clients to manage their documentation for their customer, their regulatory, and their certification requirements. I lead our educational content and our partnerships at Provision. And today I'll be the host of this webinar, kind of rallying these experts from TAG. So for those of you who don't know TAG, the Acheson Group is a consultancy founded by David Acheson, who's a former official of the FDA. TAG services are renowned globally for food safety and QA, and joining us from TAG, we have Eric Edmunds and Dr. Liliana Casal-Wardle. So Eric is the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at TAG, and he has over 10 years of experience in the food industry as a regulator with the Oregon Department of Ag, and also acting as regulatory counsel for the food industry. Eric previously managed state inspection contracts with the FDA, and he led industry outreach for the state of Oregon as the FSMA rules were being proposed. Eric actually participated on the National Association of State Departments of Ag in the FSMA Technical Working Group, and he now focuses on providing regulatory consulting for FDA and USDA regulations and all of the knock-on effects for your operation. Eric has a biology degree focused on environmental genetics from Westminster College, and he has a law degree from Willamette University. He's certified in HACCP and also a registered environmental health specialist with NEHA. So welcome, Eric.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We also have Liliana joining us today. Liliana Casal-Wardle is the Executive Senior Director of Food Safety and Supply Chain Risk Management at TAG. She has over 28 years of experience in private industry with technical and leadership roles at the Hershey Company. So at Hershey, Liliana was responsible for food safety and QA compliance throughout their supply chain and managed suppliers directly, in addition to their facilities, their partners, and their distributors. Liliana did this both within the US and internationally. She joined TAG in 2019, and she works with internationally renowned companies developing and implementing their strategies for regulatory compliance, risk mitigation, product and process design, and more. So Liliana has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Buenos Aires, and she has extensive work experience across Latin America. She's authored 6 peer-reviewed scientific publications, and she's a certified SQF practitioner and a qualified FSMA preventative controls individual. So welcome, Liliana.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
That's great. I'm happy you're here too. So for the audience members, I'm going to launch a poll really quickly just to kick things off. So you'll see a question that appears for you to answer, and you can just click on your response. We're curious to learn from everyone in the audience today. What is your biggest challenge for supplier risk management? And as you submit your answers, we're going to get started in our panel interview. So the first question that we have today for Eric and Liliana is about supplier applications. We have a lot of clients at Provision who, while they were on paper, had really rudimentary risk scoring procedures when they were assessing new suppliers. What we saw is that a lot of companies would throw some suppliers in a high risk category if they had a ready to eat product, maybe low risk for packaging, and everything else in between. And we're really starting to see that shift so that there's more thorough procedures. So Liliana and Eric, I'm curious to hear from you. What direction is the market moving in to enhance these procedures for their new supplier applications?
So the expectations for a supplier risk management program is that you look at it as something that the same things you would have for your own plants or for the places that manufacture your own products. So you're going to start a process by understanding the risk of what you bring to the plant, and you're going to finish it by building what is going out. And in the middle, how you're going to manage those biological, chemical, and physical risks. And you have the same expectations for your suppliers. You expect them to follow the same process with different burdens to carry. If they're working on a ready-to-eat product that they're going to bring to you, they are responsible to make sure that this product is ready to eat. If they're selling to you a product that is going to be further processed to handle the biological risk, you still have to think on how you're going to handle the chemical risk. Are there any allergens on this ingredient? If it's packaging, are there any toxic substances, residual toxic substances that could stay on the process? And you have to try to find mechanisms to support you. It's a high burden, and usually it's very under-resourced. The supplier management programs and departments are usually low-resourced in people because they cannot assign the same number of people to work on the supplier management program that you have when you're working at your plant or at your manufacturer's plant. So that's where you have to find alternatives to be understanding what risks they have and how they're managing those risks in the same way that you're managing them yourself. So you have to look at what tools you have, and digital tools are one way to have good data, good on-time data, live data that can give you information to resolve quickly history of recalls for that supplier, failures or near misses that supplier can have. Those are opportunities that you have. And I'm going to let Eric catch up on the regulatory side as well.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll go a little extra regulatory because really, I mean, the days of considering just your ready-to-eat product is high risk and everything else is low risk is kind of gone by the wayside. And really, the opportunity to enhance your program is to really dive into more metrics and provide a greater scale upon which you can judge the food safety programs of your suppliers. So the general idea, I think, just with the litany of potential hazards that Liliana mentioned, it doesn't really boil down to just ready to eat versus not ready to eat. But looking into your kind of supplier questionnaire and dive down on some broad questions, the 5 to 10 questions that allow you not only to say yes or no, but also to create some sort of scoring system within those. So instead of just asking, do you have an allergen management program, ask for a little bit more follow-up that can really judge and grade how that allergen management program is being implemented. And beyond USA regulatory, you have to think about things that could take more of a global view. I mean, sesame is something that is new to the United States as an allergen, but if you'd been looking at that from a global view for Canada and the EU and things, it would have been something that you would have already been looking at that can factor into your scoring system. And then really looking into kind of their processes and what else could be a potential hazard and focusing in on those to make sure you're getting a true gauge of their overall systems, not just yes or no questions to give better scoring opportunities to see how they're managing the systems aside from just having programs in place.
And that I'd like to add, if you want, I mean, what Eric said is spot on. An important thing to know your suppliers is to establish methods of communication with your supplier. Don't just think it's a once a year visit that you have to have and then just ship product from their facilities. Build communication, and that's where the tools of food safety culture are going to be very relevant. Build communication, request visibility, track KPIs that are leading indicators like environmental monitoring programs or near misses at the facility instead of looking only at lagging indicators and how they track their consumer complaints. The more you build that communication, the more you build that trust and build a relationship where the good supplier is recognized in different ways. And the suppliers that have difficulties know that they can come to you because you're going to help them. It really creates a strong supply chain.
Okay, that's perfect. So the key message here is that more nuanced risk scoring leads to better risk management. So it's all about building not just an understanding of the level of risk generally, but where that risk is coming from specifically, and then kind of using that as a springboard to follow up with that supplier in a much more thorough way that protects your company. So I think that's a great starting point. And Liliana, you mentioned compliance metrics, which I think flows in really well into this next segment. So, we've seen a lot of paper-based companies who lack some supplier compliance metrics entirely, not just in safety, but also in quality. So, how should performance be measured for approved suppliers after their initial application?
Yeah, it's definitely not a one and done situation where you get the approval and everything's taken care of and you're good to go forever. So, but it's also an aspect where you don't really want to rely just on an annual audit, whether it's third party or second party for that. The risk isn't static, it's constantly changing depending on their operations, and they may be introducing allergens. And as Liliana mentioned, the key there is having good communication channels with the suppliers so you're able to get more regular updates instead of just an annual document. And besides just the kind of broad overview annual assessment document request, there are opportunities to really grade your suppliers on an ongoing basis. I mean, you may not be able to visit them or get documents on such a regular basis, but you are receiving product from them, and you can gauge and kind of keep records and metrics of things that are coming with those shipments. So maybe it requires a certificate of analysis, and you're tracking, did the certificate arrive before the shipment, or are you waiting to unload the shipment to actually receive the certificate, or is it not there at all, causing issues with your with your receiving processes and programs? And then, I mean, and it goes beyond just certificates of analysis, because you can look at quality parameters and additional safety parameters. So you may have the major instances of a temperature control products that's received above temperature specifications, that's going to be a kind of automatic reject or big issue that may be major. But there are other things that related to quality and operations that you can be looking at too. So if you're doing really quality specification checks on the product, whether it's color or brick scores or anything like that, really judging that to see how they're performing over the year, instead of just singular supplier audits, that can really create kind of a scorecard that you can use to work with them. And if you see issues rising up or short shipments or anything like that, there's an opportunity to open those communication channels and work with the suppliers to address those in more of a partnership instead of a purchaser seller type of agreement, where you're really creating opportunities to identify issues and able to work with your suppliers to address those before they arise to the level of something that could be considered a crisis or a reject of your ingredients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to add to that, I mean, knowing your supplier is knowing the metrics that your supplier has. Every grower, every manufacturer is going to have metrics to track their success, the effectiveness of their processes, and the quality of their products. So understanding what metrics they have and how could you integrate those to yours. And that's where communication is very important, because what kind of metrics they have is going to tell you how they're managing the product. And if they're managing the product correctly, that's fine. And if you can offer opportunities of improvement, that's going to show them better productivity, less waste, because the product is going to be compliant, better handling of the product, that helps them build and strengthen their process. And that's where the partnerships are built. You build partnership by sharing goals and sharing expectations and showing them that you're holding hands together, that they're not just a supplier, that they're a partner. And when you're a partner, you share knowledge, you share expectations, you share learnings, and you share support. So you're going to build and strengthen. So, for example, if there's a hurricane coming in Arkansas and we're sourcing product from Arkansas, call them first and ask them if they're ready, if they need any help, if they were able to protect the product. Because comforting them at that time is not only a nice thing to do, it's understanding that they might need your help and that you're ready for them. Okay. So those kind of things, if they have a recall, make sure that you connect with your supplier and ask questions about that recall. You would expect that they communicate that to you, but even if they don't, follow up, because that partnership gets built with the trust from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. You know, we've seen that a lot of companies really struggle with guesswork on how their supplier is performing. And I think the key point I heard there is that, you know, the risk isn't static, it's always changing. And so the performance needs to be measured continuously. And, you know, once you start to implement at least a couple key metrics, those can just be pulled out of the records you're doing anyways. So, you know, like Eric mentioned, if you're doing just a receiving inspection or anything like that, those are all instances where you can start to capture supplier performance and then use that to build culture. So we've seen companies really use metrics as the backbone for their communication. So they might have a system of rewards or demerits. So ways that you could take action on that would be, if they go a certain number of months without a rejected shipment, or, if they eliminate a finding that they had in the previous month, or if they meet quality specifications for a year, at least a certain percentage of time. Those are all things that can be celebrated, and, that can really double down on that trust that Liliana, I think you were pointing out as the key thing to drive. So I think that's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
The next piece that we have here is about the audits themselves. So, throughout the year, we've talked about having, this great capture of compliance metrics, but the audits can still be a big focal point for, you to collaborate with your suppliers and enhance both your safety and your quality. So we've seen a real increase in the number of supplier audits that are being done among our clients, which is good. But too often, that audit's in a silo. So I'm curious to hear from you two. What are the best practices for conducting those supplier audits today?
Mm-hmm. So when you do a supplier audit, you're taking a picture of a moment, okay? And on high-performing facilities, usually that picture of a moment is a reflection of what goes on every day, but it's never a guarantee. So every time that you go back to the supplier every year, you're taking a picture of a moment and you're documenting it in paper, and you're looking at the nonconformities and doing the CAPAs for that and implementing the corrective actions and closing the audit. And that happens for certification audits, that happens for client-based audits, and it has to also happen in internal audits that they have. But the idea is, in order to dive in more into how that company is living their everyday, what challenges are they having, what are the strengths, how are they monitoring those strengths to make them build the culture within the company, it's good to look at history of audits and look at trends of audits. And there's some things on audits that might happen once and get resolved. But if you happen to find that in 3-4 years of client audits or GFSI audits, there's trends of certain nonconformities that might not be critical, they're major, even minor, but get repeated. It's a culture that it's really living the moment. It's really addressing the day of the audit to make sure that they are compliant. But what are they doing every day? The unannounced audits are another good tool, because you show up and you expect to have the facility working in the same way that they would be working for an audit. But even like that, if you don't do some trending and tracking, it's harder to understand what are the solid areas where they really need help. For example, if you find in 3 years of trends of data that they're not managing a lot of hits in the metal detector for a certain line, okay, and they're just addressing immediately the problem. Oh, let's clean the line, or let's separate this problem. You're not looking for the root cause. It's really a huge violation of your hazard plan, and it is a critical nonconformity, because even though it's a point in time, it's been happening with a trend. So that's where the trend is very, very, very important, okay? Because yes, they stop the line every time, but how many times in 3 years have they stopped that line because they have too many hits on the metal detector? So those kind of information is very good to understand the history of them, the repeats, and again, establish a channel of communication. And if there's a need for education, build that into the relationship. Help them educate their teams so that you build a stronger workforce in that supplier. It's in your best interest to strengthen your supplier to make them stronger for you.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Liliana said, and kind of looking at it all, the audit is definitely industry standard for a third-party audit, and many times that's kind of looking at it and saying, well, that's what you need. But I think from a best practice standpoint, one thing that we always emphasize is that you really do want to make time for in-person visits and not rely solely on the third-party audit or something like that. Number one, there's the term that's always trust but verify. So it just provides you an opportunity to actually see in practice that things are true to the audit or what the auditor. But it also creates opportunity to further build that relationship with the supplier. It's not just an email address. You can get a face to the name and interact on a more regular schedule. And in person is always tends to bring about more information and more forthcoming things that you can track in your records that you may not get otherwise. So I'm looking at the poll, and the data sharing and visibility is one of the higher percentage answers, and that in-person interaction really does create more opportunity to get better visibility of what the issues the suppliers are dealing with and how you could help them to better meet your specifications or just create more of a partnership. So, and kind of tied on with that, we're looping back to your overall hazard analysis and risk assessment. These don't have to be the 2 to 3 day audits that the third-party auditor may be looking at. You may pick a frequency and really even just do a half-day visit to have a tour and kind of get a feel for what they're doing on a day-to-day operation. And you can use your hazard analysis to focus on specific issues that are of concern to your company. Maybe they're handling number of allergens that you don't have in your facility, so you just want to look at their allergen changeover program and make it a little simple and focused onto the risks that you've identified to see how they're being controlled. It also provides you an opportunity to give kind of face-to-face kudos for things that they're doing well. So that always does help with the overall relationship not being just negative the entire time or looking for improvement, but giving kudos and really telling them where they're doing a good job. And that helps continue kind of the multi-point snapshots where you're just creating more of them, whether in-person or third-party audits or reviewing their internal audits to see how it's working on an ongoing schedule. And the last thing that I kind of want to touch on here is most companies have suppliers and backup suppliers that they're working with. They're multiple suppliers of a single. Using these audits and your in-person visits to really benchmark and do that ongoing grading of your suppliers, but creating data that you can actually refer to in comparison of your suppliers for their overall audit scores and everything else to see how they're performing and to one another to see if that kind of in the end may dictate primary suppliers versus backup suppliers and where people are moving. That the in-person presence in their facility just gets you access to more information, more visibility and straightforwardness than reviewing documents.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Yeah, I really like that. So a key point I heard there is just the importance of context leading into the audit. So we can start to see, how these topics really cross-pollinate each other. So, if an auditor has scored high in certain risk areas during their application, if they've scored low in different compliance metrics throughout, all of that might inform how you conduct the audit. When you conduct the audit, it can be a huge leaping off point for safety culture and ultimately lead to scoring that allows you to compare suppliers and then change how you might manage them on an ongoing basis. So I think that's really great. So the final topic that we have for the panel today is on data sharing. So when we picture, a company that has many operating locations or perhaps a vertically integrated supply chain, it really used to be that each operation was individually managed for most of their day-to-day. And, kind of regional collaboration would be more occasional. Maybe it's somebody driving to a site periodically or, a monthly call. Sites were really kind of existing in a silo. So how are we seeing that changing, in terms of frequency of check-ins, shifting away from internal audits? What does that look like for a company with an integrated supply chain today?
It's a good question. And you said historically things are operating like that, but in reality, vertically integrated operations still tend to be siloed on a day-to-day basis. And communication, we often see the communication between our company and another, but it's just because they're under the same corporate umbrella or some vertically integrated supply chain, the day-to-day operations are still very much siloed in many instances where they may not be communicating as clearly. So looking at that aspect, the supplier audits, then the annual things tend to be a little infrequent compared to the data and information you're really trying to get. So, and relying on just internal audits that are within the same company, even though it may be a corporate auditor or something like that, doesn't really provide the information that you're always looking for. So creating clear communication channels along the supply chain of a vertically integrated company, so you're really familiar with which factory is producing your ingredient, or due to whether it's a natural disaster or anything else, when production may be shifted to another facility, and making sure you have contacts there that you're able to work with and communicate with to avoid issues or get quick responses in the event that you find something on your incoming product. So, I mean, communication is always a challenge, especially when you don't have direct contacts at various steps within a vertically integrated company or along your supply chain. So creating more rigorous programs that give you that. You can also look into, even if you're going the automated route, ways to manage permissions to different data to protect confidentiality, and apply things kind of across the board, or depending on a specific hazard that's identified for a facility or a supplier as a whole, and use that to really communicate internally and with your external partners to avoid things from going undetected or unnoticed over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to add to that, even companies that are global and have some overarching global compliance programs established, they tend to be verticalized and regionalized in different ways, because they have to absorb the components of their own regional cultures. So if you are sourcing from a global company or a regional company, understand the drivers of their culture, what KPIs they're using, have dashboards built on how they manage the risk, because you might be surprised. You think you know their corporate office, and they're doing things different. Just this morning, I was with a client, and we were talking about exactly that, KPIs, and how the regions manage different KPIs based on what they're pursuing and what they think are the best drivers for success for them. So communication is key. Having dashboards for understanding where the risks are, understanding their hazard analysis, and how they incorporate their own regional risks to that product. For example, how they manage the crisis management programs. Do they control any weather risks, for example, that might happen, floods or droughts or things like that, and understand those and build those, and have ongoing communication and review of those dashboards to look at trends and focus a little bit more on the near misses, because the near misses are going to show you in those dashboards where something could have happened but didn't. So how do we manage those? How do we make that better so that really it doesn't happen, okay? Because if not, what was a near miss today is going to be a failure tomorrow. So we have to address it. And having data, managed data, and having proactive data that shows you upfront what the process is, not only what the product has, is very, very important to manage those risks.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's phenomenal. And, there's such an opportunity for companies to have better day-to-day visibility today. The key point I heard there was just having a shared system, and you can pull KPIs out of that are custom to your own operation, custom to your own region, but really having better unification of all of the data so that people are going off of shared understanding can really be a great starting point for starting to not only control mistakes, but really build the safety culture. So I think that's a great point for us to close on. So rounding up some of the key learnings from today, in risk scoring, really seeing a move towards more nuanced risk scores. that can uncover particular areas to focus on for a supplier after their application is complete. For metrics, we're really starting to see a shift towards day-to-day monitoring of supplier compliance, pulling those metrics out of other ongoing food safety and QA records. For supplier audits, we're really starting to see companies tying in context. So auditing differently based on, historic risk scores, historic compliance metrics, and then having better follow-up where you might, analyze, whether or not findings are repeat or one time, and using that as a platform to kind of build safety culture and trust with that supplier. And then finally, within vertically integrated operations, having more collaborative data sharing so that there are fewer surprises and kind of better visibility into how these programs are managed. Liliana, Eric, I thought that was great. Did you guys want to add any final thoughts before we?
I mean, from my standpoint, I'm very passionate about supply chain management and what the components of food safety culture that you have in your company towards your suppliers, and make sure that when you get to a point that your culture is mature, export it and share your best demonstrated practices and share your successes, and also share your challenges and your failures, because when you build that relationship with your suppliers, it's much easier to succeed. And the other thing is to have a backup. Always try to have backup suppliers for your key ingredients, or for those unique ones that are going to make your product succeed because they just bring the flavor or the texture that you want. Make sure that you're not on a one supplier situation, because that can create big hurdles.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And so I'll kind of go a different route and just talk about that relationship building opportunity with suppliers and how much that really can help in sharing information and getting information on a quicker level. If you're just limited to really being a email communication document request person, if a supplier does run into a new issue, you're probably not going to be on the top of the list for contacting. And it'll be a process in protecting confidentiality and deciding what they're going to do. But if you really build out that relationship, you're increasing your odds of being a partner that they may consult with on issues, or if they're starting to get into kind of issue spotting that's not yet a crisis, reach out to get you information that's going to help your company quicker and avoid a crisis or recall from occurring from further down the supply chain.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both for your insight. For members of the audience, Eric and Liliana are going to stick around for a few minutes. We're going to move into audience Q&A at the end, but in between, we want to show you guys a preview of how you can take action on some of these recommendations from Eric and Liliana. In light of the key learnings, I'm curious, we're going to launch a new poll and just ask everyone in attendance, now that we've kind of learned some of these best practices, how happy are you with your current state of supplier management? While you answer that poll, I'm going to move on to the solutions preview. For those of you who haven't already gone deep on Provision, Provision is a platform that lets you enhance your food safety and QA procedures and documentation. Generally, what we found is that companies on paper have really limited guardrails and limited efficiencies, but many alternative technologies had guardrails that were too complex. And so it actually slowed down non-technical staff in trying to use them. So at Provision, our focus has been on creating a more usable system that has guardrails that are fast and easy for staff who would otherwise only know how to text. So Provision, when it's implemented for a client, it's always custom to their own food safety and QA documentation, their own procedures. And supplier management is just one piece of that pie. Usually it would span an entire food safety and QA program. But we've partnered with TAG and many other experts who've helped us to shape that core functionality for supplier management. And we just want to show you a preview of some of the customizable ways that you guys can start to implement some of these recommendations. So I'm going to switch what I'm doing here and just share my screen and jump right into the preview. We're going to be really quick in showing this preview today. The first thing that I want to show is supplier applications. From the poll, we saw that a lot of audience members were struggling with documentation, data visibility. So I just want to show what it looks like to streamline some of that. What we believe is that, a lot of companies are struggling so much with that data sharing that they don't have the time or the capacity to do the risk scoring that was recommended. So I'm going to show ways that you can alleviate that. One of the first things that really helps is task management, notifications, alerts, and reminders. So if I were initiating a new supplier application, what I could do is I could assign a template to my suppliers for them to complete an application. I could pick, one or many of these suppliers who would go through it and give it a due date so that I can automate the notifications, the emails, and the reminders. So when I assign that task, I can track and monitor that task. I can see it here that I've assigned an application to a certain supplier. That supplier will be notified within provision, but they'll also be notified by email as well. So it can really take away some of the day-to-day burden of just chasing people to do an application in the first place. Within the application itself, it's totally customizable for you to configure what documents you want to capture and what data you want to capture. So just giving you an example, which again is customizable, you could capture data like the company, contacts, what products they're supplying you with. You could have them required to upload certain documentation. And you'll see the asterisks here that indicate required fields. So if a supplier ever gives you an incomplete application, it'll actually bounce that application, show them the errors they've made, highlight and color code them. So you're never going to have to spend time dealing with, incomplete applications. And that can really open some opportunity for you to focus on risk management. So when it comes to risk management, you could start to capture data from your supplier, like, their certification, and if they're SQF, what was their most recent result? If they had something like a fail to comply, that could be a key indicator of their risk. So I'm going to open up this verification panel. I can see this as a manager right now. That's going to add to their total risk score. And as we add more pieces in here, like, the products that they're managing, if they've had a recall, and then the preventative control programs that they have in play, all of these things start to add into the total risk score down here, where we can see them getting automatically categorized. But the important thing is that these checklists can lead to follow-up questions. So if you wanted to go deeper on, something like chemical hazards, if they answer no, that could actually reveal a follow-on question for them. The important thing, though, is that because all of this risk scoring is automated, you can get a really good benchmark for which suppliers present you with risk in certain ways. So all of those forms, when they're submitted, can be automatically summarized in custom reports, and you decide what information you want to pull out. So an example for risk scoring in an application could be that from all of those supplier applications that we've received, we've just got a really quick comparison here for not only the total risk score and the category for our suppliers, but also where they're presenting certain risks. So we can at a glance see that, the yogurt company might present more risk than others for physical hazards and allergens. And this could inform us in having a much more sophisticated audit where maybe we double down on those areas, or maybe we start to check in on ongoing compliance metrics in those categories with the supplier. So having these smart applications can really be a jumping off point for you to have kind of more follow-up in those areas. So those kind of scores are not unique to the applications. You could also do something similar in an audit. So if I were jumping into a supplier audit really quickly, what I'll show you is that when we go through this, we can tie in some of the findings in an automatic way so that we have better context or trend lines like Liliana mentioned. So Liliana mentioned one of the key things is understanding, have they had repeat findings in certain areas of the audit? So a way that you could streamline that with a tool like Provision when you're conducting your supplier audit is that, as long as you're passing areas of the audit, you're fine. But as soon as you fail an area of the audit, the system is going to automatically track which audit standard that happened against. Again, this is totally custom to your own operation to create your own standards. But you'll see here that it's prompted follow-up action. So I can put in, certain findings here, like, hand washing station is missing for production line B. And then I could assign out a supplier corrective action here. So in terms of getting better follow-up to these audits so that they don't exist in a silo, I could submit this right back with corrective action required. And it's going to create a task for that supplier, just like their supplier application that we looked at before. So they'll get an email notification where they'll be able to view this record, see the findings, and then actually follow up on it. And the important thing is that as we go through and have different findings throughout this audit, we have automatic scoring on the audit. So we can see here a summary of findings. So from each of the categories, it's summarizing, how many times we've had findings and then the total findings overall. And this kind of scoring can lead to the trend lines that Liliana mentioned. So again, I'm going to go back to reports, which is really our insight center. And I can open up those audits and look at all of my supplier audits and see, as an example, Southwest Apples here, for 3 consecutive audits, they've had findings on personal hygiene. So that might be a really important finding for us, and it's instant for us to find that information. We could instantly search for particular in here, search for a particular type of finding, and really start to manage risk based on repeat trend lines of these audits. So total findings just tends to be tip of the iceberg. And these additional categories that you build out, which are again custom to you, those can really be where you unearth ways to manage that supplier custom to their own risks. So the important thing is that you can unify all of this supplier documentation with all of your other ongoing documentation so that you have kind of a multifaceted way of looking at supplier risk. So I'm going to show you guys just one example because Eric mentioned doing a quality inspection upon receiving. So I'll show you guys what that looks like. So if I were doing a quality inspection inside a provision, this is just a routine record. And all you have to do is mention a supplier in any of your routine records to then later pull compliance metrics out to analyze that supplier's performance over time. So if we're getting, from a certain supplier, a certain product like honeydew, we have smart rules that can be built around that. So if I'm supposed to be getting quality grade 1, we might have certain receiving temperatures. That was one of the key elements that Eric mentioned. So there could be a huge finding or alert here if a supplier has had a temperature deviation. That's all automated. So if we receive something like a temperature of 50, you see it goes to red here, it triggers this rule, and that can trigger reporting and alerts on the supplier. The other thing here is quality grading. So you can have a dead simple checklist for all of your operators to do pass fail on things like whether or not there is dirt on the honeydew. As soon as you have failures in this quality inspection, you'll see it's automatically updating the quality grade for what you've received and automatically counting failures for this supplier. So this is all totally custom, and this is just one example of how you could capture compliance metrics. But maybe a way for you to analyze your supplier's performance over time is to just track and trend failure tallies per supplier so that you can see who's performing better or worse over time. So if you go back into the reports center for basically you could then compare supplier performance on those quality inspections over time and see what quantity you've received per supplier for quality grades. You could count things like their failures, or you could even filter down and see how often have certain suppliers been passing or failing on something like dirt or cracks in the honeydew. All of that information is right on your fingertips so that you have a better ongoing drumbeat just from your day-to-day records without creating anything new. So the important thing is that all of this data in provision can be unified across all of your locations. So if you are a multi-location or vertically integrated supply chain, all of this record keeping gets permission controlled, and you can decide what flows up to a regional or a head office level so that you have better visibility into ongoing compliance within your own supply chain. So I'll show you an example of that. If you want certain KPIs like non-conformances over time, all of your provision data can appear in dashboards like Liliana recommended. So you could filter down instantly to certain operating locations and see how they've performed in comparison to one another. If, for example, in Salt Lake City, you had no non-conformances in 2021, maybe that is a jumping off point for you to build your food safety culture. And you could even have something like a system of rewards out of all of your operating locations, which QCs are finding the most non-conformances. Ultimately, you're going to decide all of your KPIs, but the important thing is that you'll have complete visibility for whatever metrics you choose, be that non-conformances, customer complaints, anything that you figure is essential to your operations, and a way to benchmark the performance of each of your sites. So that's tip of the iceberg for how we could start to compare. And I'm just going to jump back into our presentation here so that I can do audience Q&A. So Liliana and Eric, if you guys are there, I'll just call you back on stage and we'll start to go through some of the audience questions. So we have a question here from Martha. Is the tool able to help with documentation management like COAs? Yes, absolutely. So you can assign to a supplier that they need to share certain documentation. You can capture that as requirements within their submissions. Next question here, is the tool able to connect with other systems like SAP? Yes, no problem at all. So you can have an API connection. We usually recommend that clients implement provision on its own for like at least 6 months and then test what data they want shared, but then you can share data between platforms. Next question that we have is from Lisa. I'll actually point this one to Liliana and Eric first. How would you recommend securing information pertinent to recalls for Supplier?
Yeah, I can start there. And on the initial discovery phase, I think the FDA is actually living up to what it's saying it's doing with some technology solutions there, where you can actually look into the FDA data dashboard and look for facility specific, not only inspection history, but recall history. So it's getting it directly from the source there. When it gets into specific CAPAs and things with the supplier for what they did to address the recall or after the fact, that's really going to rely on your kind of relationship with them and communication channels to go through the process of either helping with the CAPA or really evaluating and determining what they did. So a combination from public resources and for the more confidential specific information, it really will depend on your relationship and communication channels with that supplier.
Okay, great. Next question we have here is related to audits. So when would you guys recommend involving a third-party auditor for supplier audits, and what's the balance between doing those in-house versus involving third parties?
So, I think a third-party audit has great benefits, and it should be an accessible tool for everybody. GFSI has different schemes, and it's always good to have a third-party eyes to kind of focus and look at the operation with fresh eyes. When we're immersed in it, sometimes things that we could do better are missed because they become part of our everyday. So the internal audits are a requirement because it's a good way of self-assessing, but having a third pair of eyes looking at the operation with a different point of view is an important benchmarking that provides good feedback for improvements.
And I'd add just that hazard analysis and risk assessment that you do will help you determine those higher risks or those ones that you may want to prioritize visiting yourself, as well as kind of those very important ingredient suppliers that are without whom you couldn't do business or couldn't process your product. So both on a kind of overall risk level and volume level, looking into prioritizing those for more in-person type of audits where you're not just relying on the third party.
Okay, perfect. The next question, I know Liliana, you've worked at an international scale with Hershey. For a global operation like that, if they were to have more connected data sharing between their sites, what kind of metrics would you recommend for that style of operation that could flow up to a regional or global level?
So like I said before, global companies have their overarching policies and they establish how to manage, and then the regional areas manage those in different ways. So the kind of KPIs that are always important to have are, of course, the lagging ones. Your consumer complaints in each region are going to tell you what the consumer expects from you, and look at those not only from the food safety standpoint, but also look at quality complaints like, is the packaging open? Because at the end of the day, the consumer has expectations. Those should be your drivers. But also try to have in a dashboard those leading indicators for the operation. Like, for example, your environmental monitoring program. There's a lot of great information that you can get globally from that program itself that shows you risks from zone 1 to zone 4 on how to manage those and where to put your money and where to put your training tools to improve the food safety and food safety culture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Well, Liliana and Eric, thank you again for all of your insight today. That was really helpful. For anyone who wants to follow up with the Acheson group, is there a certain way that they should get in touch?
Yeah. With us?
Yeah, just a website.
Yeah, we can share our emails. Of course, we can share our emails on this chat or when you send the recording. I mean, you suggest, Kevin, what is the best way, but definitely we're open to communication, and it's a pleasure to have you all assisting to this panel, and we'd love to communicate with you.
Yeah, I was going to say that our website may be the easiest way to get the information. We have bios of everyone on the team, as well as emails and phone numbers there. So feel free to reach out. And it's been a pleasure being here.
Well, we've got 2 final poll questions that I'll launch for the audience right now, just to wrap things up. And then I'm going to share 2 resources. The first resource that I'm going to launch as a handout is TAG's supply chain risk management brochure. So in the handouts, you will see that is now available for you to download. And for any of you who are interested in learning more about the tools you can use to implement this, you'll see that there's an option for you to schedule a time where you can get a demo and any kind of Q&A that is needed to implement a supplier management solution. Maybe that's something that helps with the data sharing and visibility, the certificates and documentation, supplier audits, anything that you guys mentioned in those polls are all solutions that we can help you tackle. So thanks again to the panelists today, and thank you to the audience for joining. We'd be happy to follow up